Will you pray with me? Merciful and loving God, thank you for your presence with us. Thank you for the word that brings life. Bless us as we come to this preaching moment. Hallow it. Make it whole. Make it yours. Give your people a word that they might hear and might be transformed in the hearing. Amen. It has occurred to me that I may have heard more about the Ten Commandments in the news than I have in church. There has been an ongoing pitched battle over the desire by some to display the Ten Commandments at courthouses, state capitals, public school buildings, or city municipal buildings. And since 1980, there have been 8 major court cases, including 2 U.S. Supreme Court cases, arguing over the public display of the Ten Commandments. And yet, for all of this controversy and the number of debates and cases addressing the Ten Commandments, I am not at all confident that we have any deeper understanding of them in our time. I know that lawyers and judges and politicians may not be much moved by the theology and religious history of the Ten Commandments. In the legal briefs and the court rulings, there is very little discussion about what the Ten Commandments are or for what purpose they were given. In the legal and political fighting over them, something has been lost. Something has been lost, something precious and something enduring has been lost. The commandments may be familiar to us, but they have been severed from their purpose and their particularity. And even when they are universalized, they seem to be disconnected from us in some kind of way. They have become a political hot potato held aloft from deeper reflection in our ongoing culture wars and wedge politics. And lost in the discussion of the constitutionally appropriate and legally correct application of the question is any sense of what role the Ten Commandments should play in creating and constituting us as community. You know, the Ten Commandments were not just an indication of God's relationship with God's people, but they also were supposed to testify to the kind of relationship God will have with God's people. And so I want us to see that in this gift of commandments, we have a concrete spelling out of how people can honor and live with God so that they can faithfully honor and live with their neighbors. By the time God bore Israel on eagle's wings out of bondage in Egypt into the wilderness at the foot of Mount Sinai, God had demonstrated the divine determination to be in covenant. And some will ask, why? Oh, but God is determined to be in covenant. God made a covenant with the entire creation. God then turns around and makes covenant with Abraham and Sarah. And now God offers God's self in covenant to Israel. And the beauty of it is that the covenant is set in motion with a simple declaration, changing Israel's identity forevermore. A simple declaration. I am your God. I am your God. With that introduction, God and Israel are bound in covenant. They will become God's treasured possession, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And even Israel's response testifies to us. Israel responded to God's offer of covenant with resolve, declaring, everything that God has spoken, we will do. And so it begins. Israel is persuaded by God to be shaped by God, to have their identity as a people associated with God in a decisive way, to have their characters conformed to God's intent and commitment to them in covenant. And so they have in their possession not simply a checklist of moral absolutes, nor even universal principles. They have been given a strategy for enduring relationship with God and with each other. They have a means by which they practice and embody the God who has bound God's self to them. God's commandments set out what they must actually do to honor the covenant and live into their new identity and demonstrate their new character. This is life being shaped. And a particular concern to God is the life and welfare of everyone in their community, the life and welfare of Israel. And if that is God's concern, so must Israel be concerned about the life and welfare of everyone around them. Oh, you can see it in the specific commands. The first 4 commandments reveal how to live so that they do not offend God. And then the next 6 commandments show them how to live so that they do no harm to their neighbors, that they do not degrade or assault their neighbors. Oh, this is about the life and welfare of everyone in the community. And Israel will go on to testify that they get it, that they understand what it means to be shaped by covenant. They say that God has given us these commandments for our lasting good, so as to keep us alive. So as to keep us alive. It's worth reflecting on the fact that as people now fight over displaying the monuments of the 10 Commandments, Israel eventually lost the tablets on which these commandments were written. Ultimately, they did not need those tablets. The world would know God through their practice and embodiment of the very words of those commandments etched in stone. They would know those words because they saw those words in living people. They would know those commandments because Israel embodied it in their lives. This is what it means to be shaped by covenant. And I also want us to notice that the 10 Commandments do not prescribe a punishment for violating them. The punishment is immediately obvious. If we do not practice and embody what it means to be shaped by covenant with God, we risk disconnection from God. We risk broken community. We risk broken relationships. Oh, if you don't believe me, look around us. George Floyd is dead because somewhere along the way we gave up on covenant and lost concern for the life and welfare of Black people. Poor people dying because somewhere we gave up on covenant and lost concern for the life and welfare of the most vulnerable. Elijah McClain, Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Philando Castillo. I can go on and on because somewhere along the way, we found a way to disconnect ourselves from honoring and living with God. so that we can know how to honor and live with our neighbors. Somewhere along the way, we forgot. Hatred, poverty, white supremacy have interfered with our capacity to honor and live with God in covenant. So we have forgotten how to honor and live with our neighbors. Something has been lost. It's been lost. Perhaps the fighting over where to place the 10 Commandments, we've forgotten how to reflect on how to live the commandments. As the Twin Cities prepares for the trial of Derek Chauvin, the police officer charged in the murder of George Floyd, there has been deep reflection among churches, religious bodies, and clergy about how to show up, how to respond, how to be present. We here at Plymouth are wrestling with those questions. We are wrestling with what it means to practice and embody covenant with God and with each other. We are wrestling with what it means to bind ourselves in God's presence such that the world will know and experience God through us. And during this season of Lent, this is just the place we are called to be. This is exactly where we are supposed to be wrestling, to be unsure, to be thoughtful about where to go next. We are exactly where we're supposed to be. This is the tension that can only be resolved by embodying God's enduring wisdom. It's a tension that can only be resolved by giving in to covenant relationship. And here's the thing, covenant relationship is not static. It involves journey and movement and vision and progress. We can't stand still. We've got to keep asking the question, to keep probing, to keep looking, to keep making people mad, to keep fighting, to keep holding our hands up in frustration. This is what it means to be in covenant. And if you think I'm making it up, go back and read Exodus. Go back and read Torah. When we covenant with God and each other and bind ourselves in God's presence, we cannot rest. We cannot abandon the work. We cannot separate ourselves from our neighbors. And this trial of Derek Chauvin brings us into direct confrontation with one specific commandment. Do not kill. Do not kill. It is the violation of that commandment that reveals very clearly that we have lost the concern for the life and welfare of our neighbors. When killing occurs, it is a direct implication of us in the loss of our concern for the life and welfare of another. And even as we go into this trial, some of us will hope and pray that justice is done through a conviction. And then some of us will hope and pray that peace will prevail in whatever happens. Some of us are praying for all of this to occur. And through our condemnation of the defendants and through all of our wringing of our hands, we will soothe ourselves with self-justification, forgetting that this killing and so many of the killings of unarmed Black people and so many of the killings of others part of a historic and ongoing indifference to Black suffering. W.E.B. Du Bois called it a peculiar indifference. Because every day we tolerate, accommodate, and accept the killing of Black bodies. Sometimes violently and quickly in poor and abandoned neighborhoods subject to the heavy hands of punitive law enforcement, and then sometimes slowly and quietly with substandard housing, food deserts, and lack of health care. And we must be careful to remember covenant, because in the safety of our identities and by some turn of luck or by the terms of a racial contract that has enslaved and distorted Black lives, we have been offered access and choices and privileges that make it easy to avoid the suffering of communities of color. But we promise to honor and live with God in covenant. We promised that we would do everything that God said. We promised that we accept this covenant relationship, that we bind ourselves with God. And because we covenant God, we have been offered a means by which to be in community, to be God's people. We have within our grasp and tradition a strategy for covenant living, a strategy for demonstrating concern for the life and welfare of our neighbors. What do we do with it? What do we do? What do God's people do in light of the killing of George Floyd? What do God's people do? Oh, the question is more relevant than ever because as part of the church universal, we have a lot to answer for. Oh, I know. I do it all the time. We point and say, well, I'm not like the evangelicals. But we are part of the church universal, and we have a lot to answer for, because it appears that the religious have become less likely to embody what it means to be shaped by covenant with God's people. Researchers are telling us over and over, they found it, that the religious are less likely to demonstrate a commitment to egalitarian practices and compassionate care for the most vulnerable. The religious are just as likely to be shaped by their race, class, or gender as they are by the tenets of their religious faith. The religious have been just as unable or unwilling as the non-religious to sacrifice and obligate themselves to justice and fairness and social transformation. The religious are more likely to see all of the works of government and public policy as a zero-sum game. How do we practice and embody our faith differently? What are we willing to do? What are we willing to do? What are we willing to give up? What are we willing to sacrifice? I'm reminded after the march on Edmund Pettus Bridge when the late civil rights great John Lewis was pummeled over the head. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King put a call out to the world to come to Selma. And people of every faith, of every tradition, converged to the spot, knowing that their lives were in danger. They came anyway. What are we willing to do? How are we going to demonstrate our covenant loyalty? By showing concern for the life and welfare of our neighbors. We have a lot to answer for, and some things have been lost. We're not called to follow the 10 Commandments in fear of what God may do to us. There is a struggle over its particularity and its universalism. But we are called to respond positively to them because of what God has done for us. Just as Israel was liberated, God has liberated us. God has blessed us with life. And these commandments make it possible to be the best possible people of God. I pray that we see the 10 Commandments as an invitation to be shaped by covenant. And I'm talking about covenant reawakened. covenant embodied. Not theoretical, not figuratively, but lived out. Lived out among the people, lived out with Black lives, with indigenous lives, with immigrant lives, with the lives of poor people, lived out fully. I'm talking about covenant that takes seriously what it means, what it means to practice and embody God, as Israel did, such that when the world looks at us, they know that we are both in relationship with God and that they themselves are connected to God through us. This is our time. This is our moment. Not just the season of Lent, but going forward to reawaken that covenant that gives us that pull, that push to demonstrate, to embody our concern for the life and welfare of our neighbors. To honor and live with God more fully so that we can honor and live with each other. Amen.